Well, finally, we have the privilege of having Shabina Begum. Those of you who've read her CV will just see how impressive a person she is, both in terms of her practice as an international child lawyer in the field of children and women's rights, but also as an academic. And you will have spotted that she won the Woman of the Future Awards in 2020 in the business category, and she also featured in Management Today's 35 Women Under 35 last year list of Britain's brightest young business leaders. Here to save the opposition is Shabina. Over to you, Shabina. You're going to go across.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can I just say, I just remembered a meme that I saw about someone not wearing a face mask next to Sir David Attenborough, and I didn't want to be that person. That's why I've kept my mask on, because you are the treasure of the family law, so we must also protect you. But thank you very much. No. This is why I make the distinction. He's the treasure. I said nothing about age. But thank you very much. So, and I would also like to mention Imogen and Oscar. You're so inspiring, both of you. And Oscar, I just think you're so brave. So I'm here shaking because of you, actually. So on our side of the motion, I am going to, I suppose, focus on a very specific issue, as Deirdre had previously alluded to, which is child marriage. Now, for me, when we think about the age of majority, it is very important to focus on the impact and the consequences of such an act. And if we're going to do that, actually, how do we strike a balance of enabling and empowering our youth, and then also making sure that we're protecting and preventing any harm from coming to them? Now, it's a tough scale, but I've kind of like taken the approach of, okay, if we think about this whole discussion of children entering adulthood, how do we feel about essentially moving the starting line behind, right? So if we start at 16, how does that actually look? And in particular, how does it look for the more vulnerable communities? And I speak very much from a gender-based perspective, because that community cuts through every single intersect. Because we're not talking about colour, we're not talking about race, we're not talking about abilities, we're not talking about just socioeconomic background, but we're talking about everyone, potentially, that could be affected by this issue. Now, as has already been mentioned, the Child Marriage Bill has recently passed its second reading, so we're hoping that this will become law very soon. But for the purpose of this discussion, actually the most important message that we feel like we finally have a victory on is raising the age of marriage and removing that exception that a 16 and 17-year-old can marry with parental consent or with judicial consent. But why is this such a significant move on part of the UK? Now, just to kind of go back to the whole global perspective, obviously we have signed up to the Children's Rights Convention, and so we pretty much agree that 18 should be the age of majority. We also then actually back the notion that child marriage is a human rights violation, and we very much stand in line with a lot of global communities when we say that. And the reason why child marriage in particular is so important is it does stand as goal number 5 as the UN Sustainable Development Goal to achieve gender equality. And this means to empower all women and girls. Now, very specifically, actually, the community that I am going to be speaking about are women and very, very specifically, are girls. And the reason I say that is because actually we need to think about sometimes the disproportionate impact that sometimes legislation has when we start to talk about gender. And just some research that I did, it was interesting to see how, for instance, when it came to the rape legislation, that was almost like the first feminist intervention that came about when it came to the law, and there was a lot of resistance then. Now we're kind of on the other end of the scale, where we have to be careful that any legislation or any move that we make now doesn't have a disproportionate impact the other way. And one of our arguments is actually, if you lower the age, that's one thing you will do. You will directly disempower a lot of girls. So what does that actually mean in practical terms, though? And the reason I say this, as someone who's done a lot of work on forced marriage, because child marriage still is yet to be legally recognised in the same way. What does this actually mean? And I'm just going to kind of go into this and break this down a little. So please do feel free to stop me if I go over for time. But the UK made a commitment actually in 2014 when we hosted the Girls' Summit to say we're signing up to this goal, so globally we're also going to eliminate child marriage and FGM. The following year, we criminalised FGM, so that's female genital mutilation. I'm sure most people know that, but I'll use that acronym. But then we waited about, 7 years now, to actually react to the child marriage part. Now, child marriage is also such an irreversible process, and the reason FGM was acted upon straight away because it had a direct health impact on a lot of girls, and so it could almost be seen. But child marriage actually has a wider impact, not just on the physical health, but the psychological, and then it has a knock-on effect on a girl's ability to access education, her economic empowerment. And for us, when we're talking about children and liberating children, we can't really talk about the wider participation if we take away their groundwork. And that's actually what we're at risk of doing if we do lower the age of majority to 16, that is. And the reason I say this, when we think about the consequences quite specifically of child marriage, and this has come through in a lot of global research, it does not only affect, as I was saying, a girl's ability to access, say, sometimes education, but sometimes this can put her in a position where she's going to fall pregnant far earlier than she should. This will then also subject her to a wider risk of being subjected to domestic violence. And these are real issues, core issues that we deal with in a lot of the cases that we deal with as family practitioners. In the UK, when we think the ideal scenario, I suppose when we think about that category of 16 to 17-year-olds, we want to think that actually they're thinking about, they've just finished maybe their GCSEs or the equivalent, and they're thinking about going on to do their A-levels or some kind of vocational course to then set them up for university. For some girls, that's not the reality. And actually, the thing that's protecting them the most right now is the system that we have in the UK. And for some communities that do subject their child to a forced marriage, it's the perception that they have to not only stay into school until the age of 16 and then go to college. That acts as a safety mechanism. And because they know that the child isn't 18, the child in effect isn't an adult, the parents have to still account to a system. And that becomes a protective factor, and that still actually behaves as a protective factor. Now, I just want to delve into the definition of a forced marriage quickly, because the UK defines a forced marriage as a marriage in which one or both spouses do not, or in the case of adults with some learning or physical disabilities or mental incapacity cannot, consent to the marriage, and violence or other forms of coercion are involved, and coercion may include emotional force, physical force, or the threat of physical and financial pressure. Just from reading that, I'd be curious to know how many people, even as adults, we just get that straight away, right? Most of us probably wouldn't, and it took me, I'd say, probably a good few years and a good few cases to actually understand what that definition means when we're trying to protect someone. You then give that to a child and say to them, or someone at the age of 16, you are now an adult, this is the definition of forced marriage, you figure out if you know what that actually means. And that's the fear and the risk that we'd be at if we lowered the age of majority, because we would then stick that responsibility on a child to protect themselves from something that's such a nuanced form of violence. And that's just one form of gender-based abuse. Now, as it stands as well, if we're going to look at a gap in the definition, if you like, forced marriage provisions do not protect, not only do they not protect, children at the age of 16 and 17 specifically, they're not mentioned, and a child does not automatically lack capacity for the purpose of the Mental Health Act. So what this means is almost like a gap in the definition, and sometimes we can actually lose children in that gap because children don't recognize that they're going to be subjected to a forced marriage. What that can look like for a lot of children, even in this country, is, oh, we're going to your cousin's house, or we're going to the mosque, we're going to the temple, there's going to be a ceremony there. It's not explained to them what's going to happen to them. They don't recognize those signs. And then sometimes there's that added risk of them being taken out of the jurisdiction for a cousin's wedding. That's what a lot of the language looks like, and that's what this child usually thinks that they're walking into, and sometimes even adults fall into that trap. What we would then do is, by reducing the age of majority, there's then no one else to actually support that category of 16 to 17-year-olds to actually recognize what's going to happen. And if they're not a part of, say, any kind of educational establishment, because it's definitely not going to be compulsory in any sense then, how do you protect that young person? Now, just to kind of throw a few stats out there, and this was from 2019, so before the pandemic, there were about 1,355 cases of forced marriage. And when those statistics were actually broken down, there were about 53 cases that had no overseas element, which showed to us how actually forced marriage is definitely an issue within our jurisdiction. But then when those statistics were further broken down, it came to light that actually 199 of those cases involved victims below the age of 18. And then when you looked at the category of 16 to 17-year-olds that were then forced into a marriage in the UK, a majority of them were female. And then when you looked at generally forced marriage victims and child marriage victims, once again, predominantly females. And the other thing that made them even more vulnerable, and this is where another vulnerable category of people come through, is actually they were more at risk of a child or forced marriage if they had some kind of disability, or if they were if they didn't identify as heterosexual. Now, when we think about all of these difficult factors that we have to consider as adults, as a young person, and if we reduce this to 16, it will actually only heighten their responsibility to try and protect themselves. Now, some of the reasons that essentially child marriage has become an issue, just say if we focus on the Bangladeshi community, that's one of the communities that I work a lot with. Some of the reasons that the parents will cite will be to protect the children from promiscuity, or to, if they're performing quite badly in school, they'll take them out of school. It's to encourage them to behave, or it's a form of punishment, or to hide their sexuality. Now, these are all very difficult issues that, as it stands, children can go to someone and explain that actually I'm at risk, or they'll know some kind of professional to go to. Once we take away that layer of protection, or that layer of support essentially, it becomes far more difficult for a young person to protect themselves. And at no point should we ever put the onus on a young person to protect themselves. And this really came through in the FGM legislation in 2015, when we had to make a amendment to our criminal legislation to finally place the onus on the parents, and created an offence of failing to protect your own child. And so are we saying that actually if we reduce this age, are we going to reduce it in terms of all of these child-led legislation? So actually leave girls at the age of 17 and 16 to figure out if they're going to be subjected to FGM, which is another tricky kind of harmful practice where they don't always recognise the nuances that they're going to be subjected to. Some of the things that I would say in terms of just negative impact as well in our submission. Now, when it came to forced marriage, actually one of the reasons why the immigration rules were changed, and I think you can only make a spouse visa if you're now 18, which is the age of majority, was because it was recognised that as a forced marriage survivor, you may come back, and you may have to wait until you turn 18 to then make an application to bring that person back. So I suppose one of the questions would be, if we are thinking of reducing the age of majority to 16, do we then also change the immigration rules? And just to digress a little, just for a second, even when it comes to the youth justice system, are we saying that actually suddenly we're going to try 17 and 16-year-olds under the adult system and not under the juvenile system? Are we then really going to give them a fair chance? So I suppose for me, I'm going to try and end on a key quote by, I think it was Julia Allen, who's an American academic, She points out that perhaps the least acknowledged harm associated with forced marriage and child marriage, in my opinion, is the inherent deprivation of dignity, equality, and self-determination that renders forced marriage and child marriage an intrinsic human rights violation, regardless of whether the victim suffers psychological or physical harm. To put that into a bit more context, what that essentially means is if you subject a young girl at the age of 16 or 17 to a child marriage, it's one of the biggest decisions she never got to make in life. You can't then expect her to navigate the political system or actually be a fully functioning member of society when she never got to make that choice. And for me, that's why I would say, and in our submission, that we shouldn't reduce the age of majority to 16, because actually what we're going to do is we are going to leave a lot of children behind. And I would go with, just in terms of, if we're going to think of provisions as to how do you empower yet also protect, there are provisions, for instance, when it comes to driving. To get a full driver's license, you can do that at the age of 17. And that still enables and empowers the youth to go out and do something very practical. And child-led campaigns, in my opinion, have been the most effective when it comes to FGM and child marriage, because actually the most empowering thing a youth can do for another youth is empower each other. So it does give them a lot of knowledge, but that still isn't enough of a reason to then reduce the age of majority so that you then open up this category of other vulnerable communities who will never meet the mark, not at 16, not at 17. That's our argument. Thank you.